Okay, moving along in our Theology Proper Part 2, Doctrine of God. We just finished looking at the concept of the use of distinctions in theology. And now we're going to move on to look at a little bit of an overview of metaphysical language, things like what's a substance, what's an essence. Because when we start thinking about things like what's a human being, what's a person, how do we understand the Trinity, how do we understand Christ as a God-man, trying to understand, essences, substances, instances of essence as substance, and so forth. It's going to be pretty important to keep our ideas straight in theology. So on or about the bottom of page 2 in your Theology Proper Part 2 handout, what we've got is substance and person terms for theology proper and Trinitarianism. So let's start with this, because when you think about this, as we are trying to explain the Trinity, for example, we're going to have a certain language to describe oneness. We're going to have a certain language that describes the individual persons or threeness. Same thing with how do we describe the oneness of God versus the attributes of God? You've got one, but then you have multiplicity. So what we need are some terms and some ideas that will help us conceptually, because minimally what we want is to maintain at least coherency, that we're not contradicting ourselves, and we're not raising problems for people to understand. Because remember, our job is to get to simplicity and clarity with respect to explaining the faith. So what you will do by learning these is actually make things more clear for people to understand. So on this, let's start with the nature language. And as I noted in our last session, I'm using the Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms by Richard Muller, the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, but ultimately what I wanted was a standard set of terms that we could use for the class. So if you don't have those two texts, they're not required for the course, but they're certainly going to be helpful for your study of theology. So on this, let's look at the nature language. We talk about a thing and its particular nature. The first term we're going to look at is the concept of essence. Okay, what is an essence? And again, here, an essence is, as we'll say, the whatness of a thing. It's the properties or qualities that make a being or thing precisely what it is and not something else. In other words, when we're thinking about the concepts of identity and distinction, what makes a thing in a particular genus or category, and we can distinguish it from other things, okay? That's its essence, those necessary properties to make it what it is and not something else, categorically speaking. So for example, at some point, we could give a list of properties or attributes on what's required to be a full and true human being. In one of the previous lectures, I mentioned how to argue for full human personhood and pro-life. Well, guess what? You have to have the concept of, well, what are those properties necessary to be a full human person? So you'd have to have the concept already in place of the essence of personhood, or all the necessary properties or attributes that make a human person, that distinguish it from a human body part, a hog, a dog, a log, a frog, or whatever. We say it's this and not that, okay? So identity and distinction, important task in metaphysics as a whole, but also in theology that we think about these concepts. So when we talk about the essence of the thing, we're really trying to distinguish all the properties necessary to give it its particular identity. So here, when we get to the doctrine of God, we're going to say, all right, what are those properties necessary to identify true divinity, okay? And so for everything, and the idea of sorting and identity and distinction. So let's say we're here in the studio right now, and I say, okay, now we're going to do, identity and distinction and sorting and all this. So let's take all the furniture, put it in that corner of the room. Let's take all the electronic equipment, put it in that corner of the room. Then we're going to take all of the paper and literature and put it in the back corner of the room on the left, and we're going to put all the human persons in the right corner. Now, what would you do at that point? Your mind would now be going and directed to what? Thinking about essences. Well, how to identify, quote, electronic equipment? What are the properties and characteristics of something that is, electronic equipment? Well, a chair doesn't count, okay? And now, I don't know, maybe I can't articulate it, but I know a chair is an electronic equipment. So eventually the mind goes to this sorting. A chair is not electronic equipment. A human person is not electronic equipment. So this is what we mean. We start to, if you're a beginner in thinking about metaphysical issues, want to think about that task of essences and sorting, because what we want is to get to the point where we identify who is the true and the living God, so we can properly submit to God, worship God, have fellowship with God. So we have to have that concept of essence correct. So now, in this case, most of the Protestant scholastic theologians used an Aristotelian system of metaphysics. So in this case, what you'd see is a distinction between the concept of essence and the concept of substance. So the next term, roughly on page 3 of Theology Proper, Part 2, we see what substance is. And substance is really this. Once you have the concept of an essence, what you'd add to essence is existence. So a substance is an existing essence. And I give the example here of, okay, a Pegasus, you can conceive of a fiction of the essence of a Pegasus, but there are actually no existing Pegasi. So you can have an essence without it ever being a substance. So, but see, that would ultimately make it a fiction or an idea in the mind, but not having individual substance. Now, for that, we can talk about what a substance is in other philosophical systems. The fact is, you've got existing essence, you've got a bare particular that is the basis for all the other properties to, again, to be the foundation or to adhere to it. There are a lot of other ways to talk about this, but again, when you think about this, 99.9% of the people you'll ever teach, unless you stay in the world of academia, what you're going to have to do is explain this clearly. You have to think about, okay, I understand it, but now as the preacher or teacher, how do I explain it to grandma and the junior hires, okay? So you should understand it, but be able to make it simple without oversimplifying it. So that's your job as a communicator. So something like this, when you think about substance, okay, as existing essence, the fact is God is not just a fiction. God is really an infinite existing essence with a whole bunch of properties. God is real, and the idea too would be substances, for example, have causal powers. Only a substance can actually produce an effect. You have to exist to actually produce effects. So for things like this, think about it this way. If you like to eat, or you're a cook or a baker, think about this. A recipe for a cherry pie would be the essence, okay? Here's all the ingredients that you need to have a honest-to-goodness cherry pie. But a recipe for a cherry pie is not a cherry pie. So when all those ingredients are actually put together in actual existence, then you have a real cherry pie that you can eat. And so you can have essence, and when that essence exists, you actually have the substance of a cherry pie. So that's how you would distinguish really the concept of essence from substance. Now we move on and we think about, which by the way, like I said, there are technical uses of essence or substance or nature, but most of the people you're going to hear in your church will talk about essence or substance or something as really synonyms. But here we move on to the concept of what's the nature of a thing. And something's nature, there's a couple ways we do this. Sometimes it's a synonym for its essence or existing essence as substance. So nature equals substance. Sometimes nature indicates literally what? The entire universe and all its phenomena, okay? Like, I want to go out and experience nature, okay? That's the creation as a whole. But when we think about this conceptually, this is important because we talk about, for example, Christ as a human being and as fully divine. We might talk about too here something like, or in another use of it, what is human nature? Well, it's all the properties or qualities that make a human being a human being. But yet, the Bible tells us that, well, technically there are at least two different kinds of substances that constitute a full human nature. There's a physical substance exemplified by the human body, and then there's a non-physical substance that is alternately designated as the soul or the spirit. So yet both of those substances, right, constitute a full human nature. Everything that makes a full human being by God's design. So that's why we have to be clear, for example, so when we're talking about the person of Christ or the Logos incarnate, right, God incarnate, we say he has a full or true divine nature and a full true human nature, but speaking as a dichotomist, we would say that the person of Christ is one person with minimally three substances. The divine substance, which is infinite and spiritual, and then two human substances, one created finite contingent physical substance and a created finite contingent spiritual substance that is endowed with rational faculties. Okay? So this is why, again, when the language gets confusing sometimes, but this is why you want to ask for clarification, even among, again, scholastic and good thinkers, because people use this language differently with slightly different nuances to it. So we want to be careful. So there's essence, substance, and nature. So when we get to Trinitarian studies, what we're going to say, technically to be a monotheist, we're going to say categorically that there is only one existing divine essence. So in the genus or category God, okay? And by the way, sometimes we'll use this as what they call type token distinctions, or you can call genus distinctions with individual instance of substances in the genus. But what we've got here is that in the genus Homo sapiens, or human beings, right, it takes a certain essence, right, to identify someone and sort them into that category of Homo sapiens. Now, if you're a human being, an individual instance of that human essence, okay, we'd sort you into the category of Homo sapiens. That's the genus you're in, because you have all the properties of being a true, full human being. You have human essence. But when we think about the genus Homo sapiens, currently the population of the earth is about 8 billion people. So when we look at that, we'd say there are 8 billion existing essences, or numerically distinct existing essences or substances in the genus Homo sapiens, okay? So we all have the same kind of essence because we're all human beings, but numerically each instance of it can be distinguished from the other instances. So we could say technically there are 8 billion instances of the human essence, okay, or 8 billion human substances. That's one way to think about it. But to be a good monotheist, when we think about the divine essence and all the necessary properties of God, if you're going to be a good monotheist, what you have to do now is say that, okay, in the genus God, here are the properties that make God God, and now there's only one existing essence in the genus God, okay? So numerically speaking, there is only one existing essence. There's not a second, there's not a third, there aren't any others, there's just one. So this is why, too, remember, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, that most of the cults, the heretics, and groups like Islam or Muslims, they're not just non-Trinitarian, they're anti-Trinitarian because they think that three persons means three gods. So this is why we need to make sure when we're witnessing to people who are anti-Trinitarians, guess what? You better be able to explain monotheism clearly, because Trinitarian monotheism is the true form of monotheism that actually exists. The Unitarian kind is not true, and the modalistic kind is not true. So when we start thinking about the oneness language of Trinitarianism, we will think about it as essence, all the properties that make God God, one existing essence in the genus God, period. So that's true monotheism. One existing essence, one divine substance, no others that exist in the genus. So that's where we're at on the concept of nature or substance and essence as nature language or oneness language. In the next lecture, I'm going to pick up and we're going to look at person language, which will sort of help us, and then we'll go into distinctions on divine attributes and other things like that. Thanks.